When detachment happens suddenly, people often assume it means you stopped caring. But psychologically, that is almost never what is actually happening. In many cases, fast detachment begins at the exact moment an illusion breaks. And illusions are not weak things. Illusions are structures the mind builds to feel safe, to feel connected, to feel that the emotional investment we made had meaning. When that structure collapses, the nervous system doesn't gently step away. It jolts. It shakes. It reacts as if something fundamental has just been pulled out from under you. We don't attach to people only because of who they are. We attach because of what they represent inside our internal world. They represent safety, belonging, hope, identity, sometimes even survival. So when the mind finally sees something it was not ready to see before, a betrayal, a pattern, a truth you kept explaining away, the shock is not just about the other person. The shock comes from realizing that the story you were living inside was not real in the way you believed it was. And the human mind does not like losing its story. The story gives continuity. It gives stability. Without it, we feel disoriented, almost as if the ground itself has shifted. This is why detachment can happen very fast, after a long period of holding on. From the outside, it looks sudden. But internally, the mind has been collecting evidence for a long time. Small moments that didn't make sense. Feelings you pushed down. Doubts you told yourself were wrong. The psyche has an incredible ability to tolerate contradiction when attachment feels necessary, especially for people who learned early in life that connection required endurance, patience, or self-sacrifice. You learn to stay even when something inside you knows the situation is not healthy. You learn to explain the other person's behavior. You learn to minimize your own pain, not because you are weak, but because the alternative feels more dangerous than the discomfort. Then one moment comes when the mind can no longer maintain the illusion. And when that happens, the shift can be immediate, not because you suddenly became strong, but because the psychological structure that kept you attached can no longer hold itself together. In trauma psychology, we understand that awareness often comes in layers. The first layer protects you. The deeper layer tells the truth. When the deeper layer finally breaks through, the nervous system reacts with intensity. People describe this as feeling numb, or cold, or strangely calm, even though something very big has just ended. That calm is not indifference. It is the system reorganizing itself after realizing that what it depended on was never as stable as it believed. And this is the part that rattles people to their core. Not losing the person, not even losing the relationship. What shakes you is realizing how long you lived inside something that wasn't fully real and how much of yourself you built around it. The mind suddenly has to ask questions it avoided before. Who was I in this? Why did I stay? What part of me needed this to be true? Those questions are uncomfortable, but they are also the beginning of real detachment. Because true detachment is not pushing someone away. True detachment is seeing clearly enough that the illusion can no longer control your behavior. And when clarity arrives like that, it doesn't feel like freedom at first. It feels like the floor dropped out from under your identity. But that moment, as unsettling as it is often the first honest moment the mind has had in a very long time. And once the illusion breaks, the attachment loses the power it used to have, whether you are ready for that or not. If the illusion breaking is what starts the process, the next thing that often makes detachment happen with surprising speed is something much more physical than people expect. It is not just a decision of the mind. It is the nervous system reaching a point where it can no longer keep surviving the same emotional pattern. We like to believe that we stay attached because we choose to, but very often we stay attached because our body has learned that holding on feels safer than letting go. And when the body has lived in that state for too long, there comes a moment when it simply runs out of capacity. Human beings are remarkably tolerant of stress when attachment is involved. We can justify behavior that hurts us. We can minimize what we feel. We can convince ourselves that things will change, especially if losing the relationship feels like losing stability. This is something we see again and again in people who have experienced early emotional insecurity. When connection once felt uncertain, the nervous system learns to work very hard to preserve it. You become the one who understands, the one who waits, the one who gives another chance. Not because you enjoy suffering, but because somewhere deep inside, your system equates endurance with safety. The problem is that the nervous system keeps score even when the mind keeps explaining. Every moment of tension, every time you silence your own reaction, every time you override what you actually feel, the body stores that stress. Over time, this creates a state of chronic activation. You may not notice it at first. It just feels like overthinking, like emotional ups and downs, like being more tired than usual. But underneath, the system is working very hard to maintain an attachment that no longer feels secure, and then one day something shifts, not necessarily because the situation suddenly got worse, but because your capacity to tolerate it got smaller. This is the part people misunderstand. They think, why now? I tolerated so much before. But the nervous system is not designed to stay in survival mode forever. At some point, it chooses preservation over attachment. When that happens, the reaction can feel abrupt. You wake up one day and the urge to explain, to chase, to fix, to hold on, it's just not there in the same way. It can feel almost frightening, because the emotional intensity you were used to suddenly goes quiet. That quiet does not mean you never cared. In fact, it often means you cared for too long without feeling safe. The shutdown, the numbness, the sudden distance, these are not signs that something is wrong with you. They are signs that the system has reached its limit. In trauma work, we understand this as a protective response. When the body realizes that staying in the same emotional loop is causing more harm than losing the attachment, it pulls back energy very quickly. And when that energy pulls back, the detachment can feel instant, even though the exhaustion behind it has been building for years. This is why fast detachment can rattle you so deeply. You are not only losing the relationship, you are losing the survival strategy you used to keep that relationship alive. The part of you that kept trying, kept hoping, kept enduring, that part suddenly has nothing to do anymore. And without that familiar effort, there is a strange emptiness. People often mistake that emptiness for coldness, but psychologically, it is closer to recovery. It is what happens when the system finally stops bracing for impact. And although it may not feel peaceful at first, this moment is often the first time your body is no longer fighting to hold together something that was slowly wearing you down. When the nervous system stops surviving, detachment is no longer a choice. It becomes a necessity. And that necessity, as unsettling as it feels, is often the beginning of real freedom. Another reason detachment can happen so fast and feel so unsettling when it does is that you are not only separating from a person, you are separating from an identity that formed around that person. And identity is not something we change lightly. The roles we play in relationships become part of how we understand ourselves. We become the one who holds things together, the one who forgives, the one who waits, the one who fixes, the one who never gives up. Over time, this is no longer just behavior. It becomes self-definition. So when the attachment starts to break, it is not only the relationship that feels unstable. The self that existed inside that relationship begins to feel unstable too. Psychologically, the human mind prefers a painful certainty over an uncertain freedom. If you have spent months or years being a certain version of yourself with someone, your nervous system organizes around that role. Your reactions become predictable. Your emotional patterns become familiar. Even the conflict becomes familiar. And familiarity, even when it hurts, can feel safer than the unknown. This is one of the reasons people stay in dynamics that clearly drain them. It's is not because they cannot see the problem. It is because leaving the problem would require becoming someone they have never been before. When detachment happens quickly, it often means that the identity holding the attachment together has started to collapse. Something inside you realizes that the person you became in that relationship is not the person you can continue to be without losing yourself completely. And that realization can be deeply disturbing, because it forces you to face a question most people avoid for a long time. Who am I without this? Who am I if I stop being the one who understands? The one who tolerates? The one who keeps trying? When those questions appear, the mind can feel as if the ground has shifted under your feet. This is why fast attachment often feels less like relief and more like an internal earthquake. You may notice that the emotional connection drops, but at the same time you feel disoriented, almost empty. That emptiness is not a lack of feeling. It is the space that appears when an old identity is no longer holding everything together. The role you played gave structure to your experience. It told you how to react, how to think, how to interpret what was happening. Without that role, there is a moment where you do not yet know who you are supposed to be. In trauma psychology, we understand that people adapt themselves in order to maintain connection, especially when connection feels necessary for emotional survival. You learn to become who the situation requires. You become more patient, more understanding, more tolerant than you naturally are. At the time, this adaptation feels like strength, and in many ways it is. But if the relationship continues to demand that you abandon parts of yourself, the adaptation eventually becomes too costly. The psyche begins to recognize that staying the same person in that dynamic means slow, light disappearing. When that recognition becomes clear enough, the shift can be immediate. You may not plan to detach. You may not even want to detach. But something inside refuses to keep playing the same role. The energy that used to go toward maintaining the connection pulls back. And with it goes the identity built around that effort. That is why people sometimes say, "I don't even recognize myself anymore," after they finally let go. What they are feeling is not just the loss of the relationship. They are feeling the loss of the self they had to be in order to stay in it. And as uncomfortable as that is, it is also a sign that something honest is happening. When the identity built on endurance begins to fall apart, it creates space for a self that does not exist only to keep the attachment alive. That space can feel empty at first, even frightening. But it is also the first moment where your sense of who you are is no longer organized around holding on to something that was slowly breaking you down. And when detachment comes from that place, it does not mean you stopped caring. It means the part of you that was disappearing finally refused to disappearing further. There is another moment in this process that often accelerates detachment in a way that feels almost too fast for the mind to process, and that is the moment when clarity arrives all at once. Not partial clarity, not the kind where you still go back and forth, but the kind where something inside you suddenly sees the entire pattern. When that happens, attachment can weaken very quickly, not because the feelings were shallow, but because the illusion that held those feelings together can no longer survive in the presence of truth. Human beings have an extraordinary ability to live with contradictions when attachment feels necessary. We can see behavior that hurts us and still explain it. We can feel that something is wrong and still tell ourselves to be patient. We can notice patterns repeating and still believe that this time will be different. The mind does this to protect the bond, because losing the bond can feel more threatening than tolerating the discomfort, especially for people who learned early in life that connection required compromise. The system becomes very skilled at maintaining hope even when the evidence is not supporting it. But the mind cannot do this forever. There comes a point where the accumulated experiences line up in a way that cannot be ignored anymore. A comment, a realization, a moment of honesty, sometimes even a quiet moment alone, and suddenly the pattern becomes obvious. You see Not just one incident, but the whole cycle. You see what you kept forgiving, what you kept rationalizing, what you kept telling yourself was temporary. And when that level of clarity appears, it can feel almost shocking how quickly your emotional state changes. People often think detachment should be gradual if the attachment was strong. They assume that if you love deeply, you should let go slowly. But psychologically, that is not always how it works. When attachment is built on a story the mind needed in order to stay, the moment the story falls apart, the emotional structure built on it can fall apart just as quickly. It is not that the love disappears in an instant. It is that the mind can no longer use the same interpretation to justify staying connected in the same way. This is why clarity can feel more painful than attachment itself. While you are still inside the illusion, there is at least a sense of direction. You believe there is something to fix, something to understand, something to wait for. Hope, even when it hurts, gives movement to the mind. But when clarity arrives, that movement stops. You realize that what you were working toward I never have existed in the way you imagined, and the system has to reorganize very quickly around that realization. That reorganization can feel cold, sudden, even unreal. People sometimes worry when they notice that after a certain realization, they no longer react the same way. The urge to explain is gone. The urge to chase is gone. The emotional intensity drops, and in its place there is a strange stillness. They think this means they have become numb or detached in an unhealthy way. But very often this is what happens when the mind finally accepts what it has been trying not to see. The energy that used to go into maintaining the illusion is no longer needed, and when that energy releases, the silence can feel louder than the chaos ever did. What rattles you to your core in that moment is not only the loss of the connection, it is the realization of how much of your emotional life was organized around something that was never as solid as you believed. And the mind has to adjust to that reality very quickly, whether it feels ready or not. That adjustment can feel like a shock, but it is also the beginning of psychological honesty. Because once you see the pattern clearly enough, you may still feel sadness, you may still feel grief, you may still remember what you hoped for, but the illusion no longer has the power to pull you back in the same way. And when the illusion loses its power, detachment does not require force anymore. It happens because the truth has finally become stronger than the story you were holding onto. After the illusion breaks, after the nervous system grows tired, after the identity begins to shift and clarity starts to settle in. Many people expect that detachment should feel like relief. They imagine that once they finally let go, there will be peace, lightness, maybe even a sense of victory. But what often comes first is something vague, redifferent. What often comes first is emotional numbness. And that numbness can be one of the most unsettling parts of the entire process, because it does not feel like freedom. It feels like emptiness. When the mind has been overstimulated for a long time, the nervous system eventually protects itself by reducing intensity. This is not a conscious decision. It is a biological response. If you have spent months or years in a state of emotional tension, overthinking, worrying, hoping, being disappointed, trying again, feeling hurt, then trying again, the system adapts to that constant activation. It becomes used to functioning in survival mode. So when the attachment finally loosens, the body does not immediately know how to relax. Instead, it often goes into a state of shutdown. People describe this as feeling cold, distant, or strangely blank. Things that used to trigger strong reactions no longer have the same effect. Conversations that once felt urgent now feel meaningless. You may notice that you do not want to explain yourself anymore. You do not want to argue. You do not even want closure in the way you thought you did. And this can be frightening because the intensity you are used to is gone. And without that intensity, the situation can feel unreal, as if something inside you has stopped working. But psychologically, this numbness is not a sign that something is wrong. In many cases, it is the first sign that the system is no longer overwhelmed. When the brain realizes that it does not have to stay in a constant state of emotional alert, it reduces the signals. It turns down the volume. Not because the experience did not matter, but because the system needs space to recover from how much it has been carrying. In trauma work, we often see that people feel the least emotional right after they finally leave a situation that was draining them. The feeling. This comes later. First comes the quiet. The problem is that we tend to associate quiet with indifference. We think that if we are not reacting strongly, it must mean we never cared enough. But the opposite is often true. When you have cared deeply for a long time, the mind sometimes has to go through a period of stillness before it can feel anything in a healthy way again. That stillness can feel uncomfortable because you are not used to experiencing yourself without the tension. The chaos became familiar. The effort became familiar. Even the pain became familiar. Even the pain became familiar. Without it, there is a strange sense of not knowing who you are supposed to be. This is why detaching quickly can rattle you more than staying attached. When you are still in the cycle, you know your role. You know what to expect. You know what to do next, even if it hurts. But when the emotional charge suddenly drops, you are left with space. And space can feel terrifying when you have spent a long time living in survival mode. In that space, you start to notice how tired you actually were. You start to notice how much energy it took just to keep the connection alive. And that realization can hit harder than the conflict ever did. The numbness, then, is not the end of feeling. It is the pause that allows the system to reset. It is what happens when the mind stops bracing for the next disappointment. And although it may not feel like freedom yet, it is often the first moment where you are no longer reacting automatically to something that once controlled your emotional state. And when you can sit in that quiet without running back to the noise, something important begins to change. Because the absence of chaos is unfamiliar at first, but it is also the first sign that your nervous system is no longer fighting to survive a connection that was slowly exhausting you. And after all of this, after the illusion breaks, after the nervous system grows tired, after the identity begins to shift, after clarity arrives, and after the numbness settles in, there is one final moment that makes detachment happen in a way that feels almost irreversible. It is the moment you stop waiting for permission to choose yourself. This is often the quietest shift, but it is also the one that goes the deepest. Because for a long time, whether you realized it or not, part of you was still hoping for something that would make letting go easier. An apology, an explanation, a change, some kind of closure that would justify the pain you went through. The mind keeps holding the door open just a little, not because it wants to suffer, but because it wants the story to end in a way that makes sense. Human beings have a strong need for emotional resolution. We want to feel that what we invested had meaning, that the effort was not wasted, that the connection was real in the way we believed it was. So even when we start to see the truth, part of us keeps waiting for the other person to understand, waiting for them to finally see what we felt, waiting for something that will allow us to walk away without that uncomfortable feeling of unfinished business. And as long as we are waiting, the attachment still has a place to live. Real detachment often begins at the moment you realize that the closure you are waiting for may never come in the form you hoped for. Not because you did not deserve it, and not because your feelings were wrong, but because the other person may not be capable of giving you the understanding you were looking for. This realization can be painful, but it is also clarifying. Because once you see that you are waiting for something that may never arrive, you are faced with a different kind of choice. You can keep waiting, or you can decide that your peace does not need their perm, isn't anymore. That decision is not dramatic. It is usually very quiet. It happens inside without anyone else noticing. You stop explaining yourself as much. You stop replay conversations in your head. You stop imagining what you would say if they finally understood. The emotional energy that used to go toward them slowly turns back toward you. And that shift can feel strange, even frightening, because for a long time your focus was outside of yourself. Your attention was on fixing, understanding, holding on, making it work. When that focus returns inward, there is a moment where you feel almost alone with yourself, without the familiar struggle to keep you occupied. This is the point where detachment can feel like it shakes you to your core, because you are no longer organized around the relationship. You are no longer reacting to what they do, what they say, what they might do next. You are standing in your own experience without needing them to change in order for you to feel stable. And for many people, that is unfamiliar territory, especially if you learned early in life that your sense of safety depended on maintaining connection, even at your own expense. Choosing yourself without permission can feel unnatural at first, even selfish, even wrong. But psychologically, it is often the moment where the system finally moves out of survival and into something closer to self-respect. What makes this shift so powerful is that it does not require anger, and it does not require the other person to become the villain. You can still understand them. You can still see why things happened the way they did, but you no longer need them to be different in order for you to move forward. The attachment loses its grip, not because you forced it to, but because you stopped feeding it, with the hope that it will finally become what it never was. And when that happens, the detachment can feel immediate, almost shocking in its finality. Not because you stopped caring, but because you finally stopped abandoning yourself in order to keep caring. And the moment you no longer need permission to protect your own peace is the moment the past loses the power it once had over you.